If you're watching this video, I don't think you should be paying income tax. Or, at the very least, I think you should probably be paying less. I'm Botanical Lich, and here is the B. In the 2025 tax year, an individual making more than $15,750 of income has to pay taxes. If you're married, your income can be thought of as being split evenly between the two partners. I think that the income level where people should start paying taxes should be much higher. Let's set aside for now that the bottom 50% of taxpayers only contribute 3% of all income tax, and instead, let's compare where we start taxing people with where people have access to direct government assistance. Many governmental assistance programs use a percentage of the federal poverty level, an extremely outdated and overly generalized model, as an access threshold. The thing is, the government provides assistance at percentages greater than 100, which means they're above the federal poverty level. For 2025, the federal poverty level has been calculated at $15,650 for an individual. So currently, if you make $100 more than the federal poverty level, you're expected to contribute part of that income to the government. The general federal standard for access to SNAP is 130% of the poverty level. That's over $20,000. Energy assistance and free and reduced ACA plans are available up to 150% of the poverty level. And the Child Health Insurance Program is provided to families who make up to 200% of the poverty level. The important part here is that the federal poverty level and the standard deductible, the income level where people start paying taxes, are basically the same number. This means that people who make almost twice the amount where we start taxing individuals are in turn receiving benefits directly from the government. We're taking money out of someone's pocket, handing it around in a big circle, and then giving it back to the same person. I want to be very clear. I am in favor of the continuation and expansion of all of these social programs, but would likely be more beneficial to the people with the least would be to lower or completely remove the tax burden on them. In fact, I would advocate for getting rid of income tax for basically half of individuals who are currently paying it. You are paying too much in taxes. Before I really get into it, I'd like to say that the way that the government reports its income tax gathering makes it difficult for a layperson to easily and accurately research and report the real amounts that people are claiming on their taxes. My frustration comes down to the fact that they report tax returns, meaning that an individual tax return is reported the same way as tax returns filed by a married couple. As such, one return could have $15,000 deductible, and another reported in the same category could have twice the deductible. There are breakdowns into smaller categories, but these categories don't line up in a way that makes them easily transferable or standardizable. That's not to say that there are not several different ways I could try to analyze the data available to me to standardize these numbers, but I would have to make assumptions no matter what way I decided to do so. As such, and considering that the arguments that I'm making are going to be general arguments about the overall state of our tax system and not recommendations for specific number reforms, I'm going to make it easy on myself and just assume every tax return was filed by an individual. This means that most of my numbers are going to trend high, as each group will have returns that should effectively be cut in half and then counted twice. But it doesn't change that there are breakpoint numbers that do exist and could be calculated to achieve the same effect that I'm describing. My basic argument is that the standard deductible for an individual should be increased to somewhere around $50,000. This would mean that any individual making less than $50,000 a year would not be required to pay any income tax. This would accomplish multiple things. It would mean that most people who are receiving some sort of direct or indirect government subsidy would no longer be expected to pay taxes, which would allow them to hold on to more of their own resources. And it would reduce the total number of tax returns that the federal government has to process by about 50%. This would remove all sorts of processing and handling costs for the government, and it would allow the IRS to spend more of its resources analyzing and processing tax returns for high-earning individuals and business taxes. You might be wondering how removing 50% of the tax-paying population would affect the overall income of the federal government. Well, in 2024, there was a federal budget income of approximately $4.9 trillion, $2.4 trillion of which was from individual income taxes, which is about 50%. Incidentally, corporate income tax only contributed $530 billion, or around 11%. If you take a quick look at this chart, you can see that the cutoff between the top and bottom 50% of gross income was just about $50K, which is why I chose that number. This bottom 50% of returns provided about 3% of the total taxes paid, or about $63 billion. Since these people would no longer be paying taxes, that would be a 3% decrease in the portion of income taxes the government took in, or a 1.5% decrease in the total government income. It's important to remember, though, that the standard deductible affects everyone, which means the top 50% of taxpayers would also see a decrease in taxation. In fact, this decrease would actually be much greater than those earning less money. To figure out that number, we'll have to calculate the amount each taxpayer would save with that change. To save everyone's sanity, I'll show that math after my conclusion for those who want to see it. In short, I'd come up with either $490 billion, 10% of the total federal income, or, if I do some tax bracket manipulation, $300 billion, 6%. Incidentally, both of the numbers I calculated here are probably overestimates, because the highest income earners don't usually use the standard deduction. They itemize their deductions, allowing them to start counting their money later. But I'll stick with these numbers for funsies. As a slight spoiler, as I continue with my logic and mathematical analysis, I come to view the idea of removing the first tax bracket and adjusting where each tax bracket starts and ends as less and less reasonable. I'm leaving it in here because I think that it was a valid direction for exploration. I thought it was a good idea, and then tried to examine it in more detail, and found out that it really wasn't. Since I'm marketing these videos as explorations of ideas, I think it's only fair that I'm honest with you about the wrong assumptions that I made during my process. Now, if you're like me, you might not be happy about any reduction in federal income, because it always means a decrease in funding for important programs, and an 8 to 11% decrease is pretty drastic. Personally, I would like the federal government to have more money, so that it can invest in expanding aid programs and making those programs easier to manage and access. So, what could we do to recoup the losses that were suffered by changing the standard deductible? Let's say we wanted to shift all of the displaced tax burden onto the top 1% of income earners. The split point to get into the top 1% is just about $663,000, which is conveniently close to the $626,000 that starts the final tax bracket. Close enough that I'm just going to assume they're the same. In order to only increase taxes on the 1%, we'll just increase the rate on the highest tax bracket. Some math lets us know that to recoup $490 billion, we'd need to increase the tax rate by 21%. And to get $300 billion, we'd need to increase it by 13%. With the original 37% tax rate, that means we'd end up with a top tax rate of either 50% or 58%. And a 50% tax rate for the highest earners isn't unheard of. In fact, for most of the 1900s, the top income earners paid a real tax rate of 50% on each additional dollar that they earned. It was actually our best boy, Ronald Reagan, who radically decreased the top tax rate on individual earners during his presidency by lowering the top tax rate from 70% to 50% for most of his term, before once again slashing it to 33% on his way out. That being said, I think a 50% top tax rate sounds bad to a lot of people who don't necessarily understand how our progressive tax rates work, or who are under the impression that high-income earners don't actually receive substantially more benefits from our government than those with low incomes. We subsidize things like their shipping, their worker healthcare, workers' wages in some cases, and we create the infrastructure for their loans, investments, etc., etc. Going forward, remember that I don't have exact numbers, so I can't find exact numbers once I start moving tax brackets around. What I can do is estimate increases in income tax and find income levels where the break-even point would be if we were to implement specific changes. For example, if we shift the brackets around and increase the tax rate on all taxed income by around 3%, again, this is after a $50,000 deductible, then we could get close to recouping $300 billion. If instead we kept the old brackets and increased our rates by 5%, we could recoup the $490 billion figure. A 5% tax increase is nothing to sneeze at, though, and I want to make sure that we don't hurt those who are making marginally more than our 50K starting point, so let's go in and find our break-even points for those two options. To get break-even rates, we'd have to start with a pretty intense guess and check calculation, because the stepwise nature of our tax system. We can make some easy assumptions, though. I would guess that the break-even point is going to be well over 50K a year, because at 50K, in our new system, you would be paying $0 in taxes, whereas you'd be paying almost $3,900 in our current system. Just in case, let's check at $75,000 first. In our current system, someone making $75,000 a year would be paying $7,950 in taxes. With the adjusted bracketing plus the 3% tax increase, someone making $75,000 would be paying $4,676 in taxes. And with just the straight 5% increase on all taxed income, they would be paying $4,012 in taxes. At first glance, we can see that both systems would have a significant decrease in taxes even for those making up to $75,000. Second, it looks like while trying to adjust the income brackets to avoid benefiting the top income earners, that I actually may have made the system less progressive, creating an unnecessarily sharp transition from untaxed to taxed, and then not continuing that harsh increase as we move through the brackets. My assumption would be that our break-even point, at least for one of our systems, would be under 100,000. So let's check that breakpoint next. It turns out that my proposed systems would actually still benefit those making up to $100,000 individually. With payments of $13,450 in our current system, $10,926 in our bracket-adjusted system, and $8,414 in our straight increase system. We can also see that a straight increase in tax percentage still seems to be more progressive than adjusting the brackets. So I'm willing to accept that I logicked too close to the sun on this one when I was cooking up my adjusted bracket. Looking back here, I can see exactly why this would occur. While shifting all the taxation rates downwards would do what I thought, making it so that savings come from the bottom $50,000 of income instead of the top $50,000, this shifting means that income is taxed higher sooner, and the lower total tax rate increase, 3% instead of 5%, means that the highest income levels are providing less proportionally in the adjusted brackets than the straight increase brackets. Since we're already above $100,000 individual incomes, and I don't think most of you are making that much money, remember that would be $200,000 for a married couple, then I've already shown my premise of, I think most of you should pay less taxes. In fact, the break-even point for an amount of income tax paid is much closer to $200,000 incomes for individuals, meaning that this suggested tax program would benefit all but the top 10% of income earners. I'm tempted to try to find a percentage increase where the break-even point is closer to $100,000. But this exploration was just to prove a point about the bottom 50% of taxpayers, so I won't dig any further into the math hole. The crazy thing for me is that all of this can be achieved just by moving some numbers around. I'm not creating a new tax system to shift the burden towards the wealthy. I'm not even suggesting new tax breaks or new credits or new exemptions. This would be achievable by changing some numbers that are already used in every tax filing. The standardized deduction is vaguely defined as being an easier method than itemizing and to ensure that those under a poverty threshold avoid being taxed. But we've already discussed that the standard deduction is far below what it should be if the point is assisting those who are less well off. If you add on top of that we're currently taxing millions of people for almost no financial benefit to the federal budget, it would make much more sense to just have those people stop filing. It would massively decrease the amount of time and money that would need to be put into tax filing by both the government and individuals. If you make under $50K as an individual or $100K as a married couple, you should just be able to send in a form that says so. Your employer would still be taking Social Security taxes out of your wages and sending those along with your income information to the IRS, so it would be easy for them to check. The IRS could even do spot check audits to make sure that people aren't hiding other income sources. But most people who are making between $100,000 and $50,000 are likely making the majority of that money from a job, which would have easily accessible records. Honestly, I still think that $200,000 per individual as a breakpoint is a little high, and it would be interesting to look into what percentage increase would result in break-even points closer to $100,000 an individual, which would be the top 25% of income earners, and is a much more reasonable break-even point for me. This would also mean that there would be more income tax revenue total, meaning we could invest even more into services than we are now. In the next section, I'm going to go deeper into some of my math, so I'll give you all permission to leave if you're not interested. I ask that you like the video and subscribe if you thought that this was an interesting exploration of a possible new tax distribution. If you'd like me to talk more about financial topics or math, or to get deeper into some of the terms and ideas surrounding tax and finances, let me know in the comments. I had a job where I had to work with people's tax documents for a while, so I feel like I have information to share if you want it. Anyone who sticks around will see all the logic and math I had to do to get here, so I'll only be doing these kinds of videos on topics that I get obsessed with. I've been thinking about our tax rates for a long time, and finding out that the bottom 50% of taxpayers only contribute 3% of the tax revenue really pushed me over the edge into making this video. Without further ado, maths. I'm gonna rip through the math really quick because I don't want to inflate my video time too much. So don't worry if you have to slow down the video or pause or go back and watch again if you don't understand something at first. I'll be in the comments answering questions too, so if you don't understand after a couple of watches, let me know. I'm definitely not perfect, so it's probably a me problem. For the amounts the top income earners would save, the first method is the new deductible minus the actual deductible, multiplied by the highest progressive tax bracket of whichever individual we want to check. Which isn't quite right either, because it assumes that no individual would cross tax brackets due to this change, which some would. The government doesn't put out numbers based on tax brackets for some reason, so I have to estimate this. Using the income splits and our formula, we can figure out that the top 50%, those that would still be paying taxes after our change, would save $490 billion, 10% of the $4.9 trillion federal income. A second solution that presents itself is that at the same time that we raise the standard deductible, we eliminate the lowest tax bracket, and start with 12% tax rate for the first $15,750 of income, then start the 22% bracket, making the same size steps as the current system from there. Unless my logic is wrong, this should mean that the top 50% of taxpayers save from the bottom up rather than the top down. In other words, each dollar that they earned over $50K would be taxed at the same rate as it would have been in the current system. The savings in this case should just be the taxes people would pay on their first $50,000 under our current system, multiplied by the number of taxpayers. I rounded the number of taxpayers and the amount to get $300 billion. Real quick, I wanted to show a cheat sheet that I used to calculate tax levels. Because the tax system is stepwise, as long as we get past the end of a step, each step is going to have the same amount of tax paid, no matter what the final income is. So, we only have to do this math once. To calculate a full step, it's just the end of the step minus the start of the step multiplied by the percentage tax rate as a decimal. For example, $70,750 minus $15,751, and then that number multiplied by 0.25. Now for the real meat of things, for the 1% push, we multiply the split point by the number of returns, and subtract that product from the total AGI for the top 1%, and that gets us the amount of AGI that's above the split point. From there, we just divide the amount of money we want to generate by the AGI above the split to get the additional tax rate that we'll need. We use the same method to shift everything over the 50K mark, which is the same as the 50% mark. I think that I'm right that I can just do this $300 billion calculation straight because the shifted brackets were already accounted for with that lower number, and we're just increasing how much each dollar is taxed irrespective of which bracket it should fall into. I actually did both of these calculations twice because I thought that the first time that I did them I just subtracted the 1% total AGI from the 5% total AGI and took that as the AGI over the breakpoint. This was my first thought, but when I started thinking about it I couldn't explain why I thought that would be correct. So I figured out a different way to do it that I could explain. I did the two sets of calculations on different days, and only after doing them the second time did I realize I had figured out this error in logic the first time as well. The calculations for the different tax systems for the same income was actually really easy, because that's what our tax system is set up for, figuring out one exact income to one exact amount paid. Furthermore, we get to carry forward our calculations from one calculation to the other, because each filled step is the same no matter the final amount. In fact, I get to pull the numbers from that table I made earlier. The total tax paid is each full step added together plus the amount left over in the step the income runs out, multiplied by that step's tax rate as a decimal. I'll flash each of these calculations up for a second. Incidentally, Excel, or Google Sheets that I use, is actually a really nice way of keeping track of numbers and calculations. It's easy to identify numbers with nearby text, and you can check back on your formulas just by inspecting the individual cells. I'm not going to do the math to find out how to make the break-even point closer to 100,000, so sorry if that's what you came here for. If you really want to know, leave a comment, and if more than 20 people seem to want it, I'll make a short about it. I'm pretty sure that that's all of my math, but feel free to ask me questions about my logic and calculations if anything is confusing you or if I didn't explain something properly.